James Edwards sat at the worn conference table, feeling the weight of the years on his shoulders. He had spent nearly 2 decades at Redstone Innovations, a company that once prided itself on its family-run values and high-quality industrial equipment. But now, under the cold light of venture capital, it had become a shell of its former self. It had started as a promising career, back when Harold Redstone, the founder, still ran the company. Harold was a man of integrity, someone who believed that numbers should always tell the truth. James had learned early that his job was not just about balancing accounts. It was about making sure the company's finances were honest. He remembered Harold's voice in his head. People lie, but numbers don't. Your job is to make sure our numbers tell the truth. But that truth was getting harder to find, especially after Sandra Holmes arrived. She came from a multinational company known for its aggressive growth strategies, and when she was made CEO, things started to change. New policies were rolled out, the cost-cutting measures that seemed innocent enough at first, but James began to notice the cracks. Executive perks ballooned, vendor payments didn't match deliveries, and certain budget lines were suddenly growing without any clear explanation. James had always been a meticulous man. It wasn't in his nature to jump to conclusions. For the first 15 years at Redstone, everything had been above board. But when Sandra and her team arrived, something felt off. As he sat across from her now, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping on the glass tabletop, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "James," Sandra began, not even looking up from her tablet, her voice flat and emotionless. "Due to restructuring, your position is being eliminated." James blinked, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. Restructuring? It didn't sound real, not after 19 years of unwavering loyalty to the company. He had given them everything, long nights, late hours, and the sacrifice of his personal life. Yet here he was, dismissed like an afterthought. Her eyes remained fixed on her screen, and for a moment, James felt an urge to stand up, to argue, to beg. But he did none of that. Instead, he just nodded. A single, slow motion. He'd been through too much in life to let something like this shake him. "We'll need your key card and parking pass." Damon Clark, the company's new CFO, added as he slid a cardboard box across the table. He wasn't even looking at James either, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor as if the situation was beneath him. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items," Damon continued, his voice dripping with the indifference of someone who had no idea what James had been through to get here. James didn't protest. He didn't ask why. He didn't even feel anger, only a cold sense of detachment. Numbness had become his companion over the years, especially after losing his wife, Diane, to cancer 15 years ago. He hadn't realized it at the time, but Diane's death had set something in motion within him. It was as if losing her had given him the strength to survive things that would have otherwise broken him. The death of his wife, the decline of Redstone under the new management, none of it felt like a surprise anymore. "Is there anything you'd like to say, James?" Sandra's voice cut through the silence, her tone one of expectancy. She was looking at him now, waiting for tears or anger, some emotional outburst that would make this easier for her. James straightened in his chair, adjusted his tie, and tucked his leather portfolio under his arm. The same portfolio his wife had given him all those years ago. He wasn't leaving with nothing. He wasn't leaving empty-handed. As his fingers brushed the edge of the portfolio, he knew that he had something far more valuable than just the contents of his desk. "No, thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. "No need to say anything." Sandra's eyes flashed with something he couldn't quite place, but James wasn't looking for her approval. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and placed his key card on the table. As he left the room, Damon didn't even offer a parting word. The air in the hallway felt thick, the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead making his thoughts seem distant. Security guard Kyle, a young man with nervous eyes, followed him to his office. "Sorry about this, Mr. Edwards," Kyle mumbled as James carefully packed up the last of his belongings. The small picture frame of his wife sat on the desk, her smiling face frozen in time. The picture had been there since the first day he joined the company, a reminder of what truly mattered. James wrapped it in tissue paper carefully, as if she could somehow still feel the tenderness of his touch. "It's not your fault, Kyle," James replied, his voice quiet. The guard nodded but didn't say anything more. When he was done, he placed the key card on the desk, leaving the office for the last time. He walked through the lobby, passing colleagues who suddenly found their shoes fascinating, avoiding his gaze as if he had become invisible. The decades of hard work, the loyalty, the relationships built over the years, all reduced to nothing in the span of a few minutes. James reached the parking lot and without saying a word, climbed into his car. Only then did he allow himself one small, tight smile. They thought he was leaving with nothing, but he was leaving with everything they didn't want found. He hadn't always been suspicious by nature. For the first 15 years, Redstone had been a company he could believe in. But the last few years under Sandra's leadership had been different. The cuts, the questionable fees, the discrepancies. He had kept his head down, kept working, kept balancing the books. But every day, more and more, the numbers weren't adding up. But James had been smarter than they thought. He had started keeping track. He had started documenting the irregular payments, the hidden vendor deals, the questionable consulting fees. He had seen enough. He had seen how Redstone had changed from a place of integrity to a shell, a company ripe for exploitation by the greedy hands of venture capitalists. His eyes glanced at the leather portfolio sitting beside him in the passenger seat. Inside, there was a flash drive containing years of evidence, documentation that could expose the truth that Sandra Holmes and Damon Clark never wanted anyone to see. As he drove home, he thought about his wife, Diane. He thought about the days when they were both younger and life felt simpler, less fraught with the chaos of corporate greed. Diane had always said, "Do what's right, James. Everything else is just noise." And now as he pulled into his driveway, he knew exactly what he had to do. The first 15 years at Redstone Innovations were the best years of James Edwards' life. Back then, the company had been small but strong, with a family-driven culture where the employees mattered, and integrity was at the core of everything they did. James had joined after earning his degree in accounting, and Harold Redstone, the founder, had taken him under his wing. Harold's philosophy was simple. Numbers don't lie, James. People do. Your job is to make sure our numbers tell the truth. And for 15 years, that's exactly what James did. Under Harold's leadership, the company flourished. James had made sure every invoice matched the inventory, every penny accounted for. There were no shortcuts, no fudging the numbers. Everything was transparent and in its right place. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and every quarter James could look at the numbers and feel a sense of pride, knowing he had helped build something real. But then Harold retired, and his son, Matthew Redstone, took over. At first, James was optimistic. Matthew was different, but he seemed to want the same things as his father, to maintain the company's good reputation, to keep the wheels of the machine turning smoothly. For a while, things stayed the same, and James continued doing his job with the same dedication. But slowly, James began noticing small changes. At first, it was nothing too dramatic, just some corners being cut here and there. The quality of materials seemed to slip, and there were whispers in the hallways about budget cuts and delays in the factory. Matthew kept telling the employees that these were just temporary measures. The company was adjusting to the new market, he said, adjusting to new financial realities. James had always been a stickler for detail, so at first, he dismissed his instincts. Maybe I'm just getting paranoid, he thought. But as the months passed, the changes became harder to ignore. The new management team, headed by Sandra Holmes, arrived with promises of an aggressive growth strategy. Sandra came from a multinational with a reputation for transforming struggling companies, and she had brought with her a vision that was nothing like what James was used to. She was polished, efficient, and relentless, and while James respected her drive, something in her approach made him uneasy. She talked about growing the company, about expanding their reach, but every conversation with Sandra seemed to circle back to the same thing: cost cutting. "We need to be more efficient, James," she would say. "We need to focus on the bottom line." That's when James started seeing the discrepancies. The first one was small, almost too small to notice. Vendor payments didn't match up with inventory receipts. James had always been vigilant about matching every dollar spent with a delivery. But now, there were invoices showing up with no record of deliveries, or deliveries listed that weren't in the warehouse. He asked Sandra about it, but she simply smiled and waved it off. "We're transitioning suppliers," she said, her smile full of teeth. "It's a temporary blip." James wasn't convinced, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, he respected Sandra's experience, and maybe she was right. But then came the consulting fees. Large amounts were being paid to companies James couldn't find any information about. Some of these companies didn't even have websites, and the invoices were being approved without so much as a second glance. The red flags started to pile up, but the one that truly set James on edge came when he found out about the executive retreats. These retreats weren't just about brainstorming and team building. They were about extravagant spending, Expenses were being approved for things that had nothing to do with company business: luxury hotels, lavish meals, and activities that seemed more like a vacation than a corporate retreat. And yet, they were all being approved with no questions asked. James tried to bring up his concerns in meetings, but every time Sandra's response was the same. This is part of the new direction. It's what we need to do to stay competitive. When he pressed about the expenses, she changed the subject, dismissing him with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Something was wrong. James wasn't paranoid by nature, but his training as an accountant made it impossible to ignore the pattern emerging before him. These weren't just mistakes. These were deliberate actions to hide the truth. Sandra, along with Damon Clark, the new CFO, were pushing the company into murky waters. Waters where the numbers didn't always add up. He wasn't sure how to prove it yet, but he began keeping notes. Small ones at first, just a list of things that didn't sit right. But as the days passed, his notebook grew thicker. He started to document everything: questionable payments, canceled audits, vendor verification forms lost in the shuffle. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about integrity, about truth. The company that Harold Redstone had built had once stood for something real, but under the new management, it was becoming a house of cards. And James knew the cards were starting to fall. But he also knew he had to be careful. Damon Clark was quick to retaliate against anyone who questioned the new direction. A few of the older employees had already been reassigned or quietly pushed out. Greg from purchasing had been one of the first. Greg had come to James with some concerns about invoices, and when he tried to ask questions, he was suddenly out the door with a vague performance issues explanation. James knew what that meant. Greg had gotten too close to the truth. James couldn't afford to make waves. He had to be strategic. So he started creating a second set of books, one that no one at the company would ever see. He backed everything up off-site: every questionable transaction, every contract that didn't make sense, every unexplained payment. He knew he had to protect himself, because sooner or later the truth would come to light, and he needed to be ready. His daughter Lucy noticed the change in him. She saw how late he was working, how distracted he had become. "Dad, what's going on? You're always at the office these days," she asked, concern in her voice. James didn't want to worry her, so he lied. "Just busy season, sweetheart. You know how it is." But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just busy season. His job was in jeopardy, and the company he had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to was crumbling from the inside out. The numbers didn't lie, but the truth was something that no one in the company seemed interested in hearing. One evening, after a long day of organizing files and documenting transactions, James sat in his car staring at the headlights of the company's parking lot. He had everything he needed. The evidence was there, neatly cataloged, backed up in multiple locations. He just had to make a choice: keep it to himself and walk away, or bring it all to light and risk everything. As he drove home that night, his mind was made up. He wasn't going to let it go. He wasn't going to let Sandra and Damon get away with what they were doing. Someone had to remember what Harold Redstone had taught him all those years ago: numbers don't lie. And it was time for James to make sure the world knew the truth. James Edwards sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as his mind raced through the last few weeks. The evidence he had carefully compiled: spreadsheets, invoices, meeting notes, and off-the-record email exchanges, sat in neat folders on his hard drive. He had followed his instincts, built his case, and yet, despite everything, he felt like he was slowly sinking into a pit of helplessness. The company he had worked for nearly 2 decades was falling apart, and he was powerless to stop it. He glanced at the clock on his computer screen: 10:45 p.m. He had been at the office since the early morning, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The reports were piling up, and every time he thought he had uncovered the last piece of the puzzle, another irregularity surfaced. It was as if the company's financial systems were designed to be hidden in plain sight, with layer upon layer of deception. But it wasn't just the numbers anymore. It was the people involved. Damon Clark, the new CFO, had become a constant thorn in his side. James had been with Redstone Innovations long enough to know when something wasn't right, and Damon's rise to power had been as calculated as it was ruthless. There was no subtlety in his approach. Everything was about control, about removing anyone who might question the new executive culture Sandra had built. James had seen firsthand how Damon had pushed out several seasoned employees in the last year, people who had been with the company far longer than he had. And now, Damon was pulling strings from behind the scenes, manipulating the books and reassigning employees to positions where they couldn't interfere. James's mind wandered back to the recent departmental restructure that Damon had orchestrated. It had come as a shock to most of the finance team. Damon's latest move was placing his inexperienced nephew between James and all the executive financial approvals. The nephew, a young man fresh out of college with no real-world experience, was now a gatekeeper for any financial decision James needed to make. It was a clear message. James's days at Redstone Innovations were numbered. His time had run out. That realization had shaken James to his core. He had spent so many years dedicated to this company, giving it his all. He had kept the numbers clean, balanced, and transparent, but it no longer mattered. Damon had taken control of everything, and now he was working to push James out the door, just as he had done to others before him. James's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from Lucy, his daughter. "Dad, are you okay? You've been working nonstop. Just tell me the truth. What's going on?" James stared at the screen, the familiar ache in his chest growing. He hadn't wanted to burden her. She had her own life to focus on, a career she had worked so hard to build. She had just made partner at her law firm, and now here he was, pulling her into his problems. But she was his daughter, and it was impossible to lie to her. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples, before texting her back. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just busy with work. Nothing you need to worry about." He had lied to her again, but it wasn't just for her sake. It was for his. He couldn't allow her to get involved, especially not with what was coming. He couldn't let anyone else be pulled into this web of corporate deceit, not if he had a choice. But James knew he couldn't keep living like this, working endless hours, digging through financial records that no one wanted to examine, and watching as the company he had helped build slowly morphed into something unrecognizable, something corrupt. The final straw came one afternoon, a few days later. James had received an email from Sandra Holmes, the CEO. It was a routine corporate communication, the kind he had seen 100 times before. But this one was different. It was a request for a meeting, an urgent one, to discuss the financial restructuring of the company. James had no doubt what this meeting would be about. It wasn't going to be a discussion of financial performance or planning for the future. It was going to be about getting rid of him, just as they had done to everyone else who had dared question the direction the company was headed. He felt a cold sense of inevitability wash over him. The hour was approaching. There was no denying it anymore. The company he had loved, the company that had once been a symbol of integrity and quality, was now a machine for profit, and he was the last piece of the puzzle that needed to be removed. When the day of the meeting arrived, James walked into Sandra's office with his head held high, but his heart was heavy. The sleek, modern space was filled with the scent of expensive leather and polished wood. Damon was already sitting there, with his arms crossed, staring at James like a predator sizing up its prey. Sandra's smile was tight, almost forced. "James," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "thank you for joining us today. As you know, we're making some changes to streamline operations and increase efficiency. In light of these changes, we've decided that your position is no longer necessary." It was the moment James had been expecting, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known it was coming, but hearing it from Sandra in that cold, dismissive tone made it all too real. They had already made their decision. They had already chosen who would stay and who would go, and he was at the bottom of their list. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was it. He had been fired. But the evidence he had accumulated, the years of work he had done to uncover the truth, were still in his possession. He wasn't leaving empty-handed. "Is that all?" James asked, keeping his voice steady. Sandra looked at him with a glint in her eyes, as if expecting some kind of emotional reaction. But James wasn't giving her that satisfaction. He stood up, gathering his belongings. His leather portfolio, the one his wife had given him, was still there, a symbol of the life he had left behind, a life he would now have to rebuild. "Yes," Sandra said curtly. "You'll receive your severance package, and HR will be in touch about your retirement options." James said nothing. He didn't need to. There was nothing more to say. His entire career, his entire life had been boiled down to a few sentences, a few cold words that no longer mattered. He walked out of her office, his footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway, the sound louder than it should have been. It was the sound of finality, of everything that had led to this moment. But as he passed the lobby, his heart didn't sink. Instead, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't leaving without something of value. He had been recording everything, every suspicious transaction, every missed audit, every lie. The numbers didn't lie, and he wasn't about to let Sandra and Damon get away with it. James walked to his car, his face set in determination. As he got into the driver's seat, he couldn't help but smile, though it was tight, almost a sneer. They thought they were getting rid of him. They thought they were taking away everything he had. What they didn't know was that he was leaving with everything they didn't want found. The days following James Edwards' termination were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and restless nights spent staring at the ceiling. He had spent nearly 2 decades at Redstone Innovations, and now he was out. It didn't matter that he had seen this coming. Nothing prepared him for the weight of walking out the door for the last time. The first few days at home felt surreal. His routine had been ripped away, leaving him with nothing but time and a growing sense of urgency. James knew what was at stake. The evidence he had gathered wasn't just about protecting his own career, it was about exposing the rot that had taken over the company. He had never imagined it would come to this. His name blacklisted, his job lost, but there was no turning back now. The truth needed to be revealed. His daughter, Lucy, had called a few times, asking him if he was okay. But James hadn't been ready to share the full truth with her yet. She was busy with her own life, and the last thing he wanted was for her to get caught in the crossfire of what was about to unfold. Still, the nagging feeling that his actions would eventually pull her into this mess lingered. That evening, as James sat in his kitchen, sifting through a pile of papers, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Lucy. "Dad, I'm worried. What's really going on? I know you've been working late for months, but this doesn't feel right. I'm here if you need me. Just tell me the truth." James set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. He was at a crossroads. The decision to walk away, to accept his fate without legal action, had been easier to make in the heat of the moment. But now, in the quiet of his home, the weight of everything he had kept hidden for so long pressed on him. The records he had stashed away weren't just numbers anymore. They were proof, undeniable proof, of a corporate scheme that stretched far beyond mismanaged budgets and inflated expenses. But he still wasn't sure how far he could go. As the evening wore on, his thoughts turned to James Parker, an old college roommate of his, who had become a federal prosecutor. James hadn't spoken to Parker in years, but he knew he could trust him. He needed someone who could help him navigate the legal implications of the situation, someone with the right connections to move the case forward without exposing himself to retaliation from Sandra Holmes and Damon Clark. James grabbed his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed the number he hadn't called in over a decade. "James Parker," the voice on the other end answered. "Parker, it's James Edwards," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need your help." There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of papers shuffling. "Edwards, it's been a long time. What's going on?" James took a deep breath, then laid out the situation. He told Parker about Redstone Innovations, about Sandra and Damon, how they had slowly transformed the company into something unrecognizable, how their actions had become increasingly suspicious, and how he had spent months documenting everything. From manipulated vendor records to executive retreats filled with questionable expenses, James had everything he needed to bring them down. When James finished speaking, Parker was quiet for a moment, his words slow but measured. "Sounds like you've been digging deep, James," he said finally. "And this is serious. If what you've got is legitimate, it could be a massive case. But be careful. Big corporations don't take kindly to whistleblowers, and Redstone's legal team will fight dirty." James's jaw clenched. He had already considered the risks. He knew what kind of power Sandra and Damon wielded, but he also knew that they weren't invincible. The evidence was irrefutable, and he was done staying silent. "I'm not asking for a favor, Parker. I'm asking for help," James replied, his voice hardening. "I need to know what to do next. This is bigger than just me losing my job. This is about everything they've covered up." Parker was quiet again, and then he spoke with quiet resolve. "All right, let me see what I can do. But you need to gather all the evidence, everything you've got, and get it to me. I'll start making the right calls." They ended the conversation with plans to meet in person the next day. That night, James couldn't sleep. His mind raced through everything he had learned, every document he had reviewed. He thought about Damon, who had become a master at erasing traces of his own wrongdoings. He thought about Sandra, who seemed untouchable, always one step ahead. But what they didn't know was that James had been recording everything: the canceled audits, the unapproved expenses, the lies that had been buried beneath layers of financial statements. He had kept copies of emails, memos, and invoices. He had the key to unlock the whole operation. The next day, James met Parker at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. As soon as James sat down, he slid a folder across the table. Parker opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the documents. The silence stretched on as he reviewed everything James had compiled, the vendor discrepancies, the ghost invoices, and the evidence of a broader financial scheme to embezzle money from government contracts. "This is solid, James," Parker said, looking up from the papers. "But it's going to be a fight. You're up against more than just bad accounting. This is about corruption at the highest levels. You need to understand that." "I know," James replied, leaning in. "But I'm not backing down." Parker nodded. "Good. I'll get in touch with some of my contacts at the SIC and the state attorney's office. We'll need to get their attention before we make any moves public. This goes beyond corporate fraud. There's something more here, something much darker." James looked at his old friend, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Parker sighed. "You've uncovered more than financial manipulation. There's something with the pension fund, too. If these guys have been siphoning off money from employees' retirement savings, well, that changes everything." A chill ran down James's spine. He had suspected something was off with the pension fund, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. If Sandra and Damon were tampering with the retirement fund, the stakes were even higher than he had imagined. The livelihoods of hundreds of employees were at risk. As James left the cafe, he felt a mixture of anger and determination. He wasn't just exposing financial fraud anymore. He was going to protect the workers who had spent their lives building Redstone Innovations. The company's legacy, Harold Redstone's legacy, was worth fighting for. That evening, as he sat back in his home office, James powered up his computer and plugged in the flash drive he had kept hidden away. He began typing up a detailed summary of everything he had uncovered. His finger hovered over the send button. The email was ready to be sent to Parker and the federal authorities, but James hesitated. He thought of his late wife, Diane, and the advice she had always given him. "Do what's right, James. Everything else is just noise." James took a deep breath and hit send. The battle had begun. The weight of what James Edwards had done hung heavily on him as the days ticked by. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was always just around the corner. The evidence was in the hands of James Parker, the federal prosecutor, and the authorities had been notified. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, and James couldn't afford to wait idly by, while Sandra Holmes and Damon Clark moved forward with their plans. He had uncovered more than just financial fraud. He had unearthed a web of corruption that threatened to destroy the livelihoods of thousands of employees, and the people behind it weren't going to go down without a fight. James spent the following days pacing around his house, restless and anxious. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had exposed the truth, but as each hour passed, he found himself doubting his decision. Every strange knock on the door, every unknown number that flashed across his phone screen made his skin crawl. He had no illusions about what was at stake now. Sandra and Damon had deep pockets and influence, and if they felt threatened, they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. It was the middle of the afternoon when James's phone rang, breaking the silence in the house. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat, but he picked it up anyway. "James Edwards?" The voice on the other end said. It was a woman's voice, cold and authoritative. "Yes," he replied, his stomach tightening. "I'm Veronica Harris with Redstone Innovations legal department. We need to discuss a few things." James's blood ran cold. He could already feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a casual call. He had known it would come to this. The company's lawyers were probably circling, trying to figure out how to deal with him. He had expected this, but it still didn't make it easier. "Go ahead," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have your severance paperwork," Veronica continued. "But before we proceed with any official documentation, we need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement to ensure that no information about the company's operations, past or present, is disclosed to any external parties." James froze. His suspicions had been confirmed. They weren't just trying to cover up the financial discrepancies. They were trying to bury everything, the truth, the corruption, and the lives they had ruined, under a veil of secrecy. "I'm not signing anything," James said flatly. "Not after everything I've found. You can't silence me that easily." Veronica's tone turned icy. "I think you'll find that your options are limited, Mr. Edwards. We're offering you a severance package, but if you refuse to cooperate, We will contest your unemployment benefits, and we will withhold payment for unused vacation time. We will make sure this affects your future employment prospects, and I'm sure you wouldn't want that." James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. They were trying to intimidate him, trying to force him into submission. But he wasn't backing down. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the employees who had been too scared to speak up, for the people whose pensions were being stolen, for the truth that needed to be exposed. "I'll see you in court," he replied, his voice sharp, "and you can be sure that I'll make everything public." Before Veronica could respond, James hung up the phone. His pulse raced, his heart pounding in his chest. They were threatening him, but he had known this day would come. He had known they would push back, but he also knew that they had underestimated him. He wasn't going down without a fight. He needed to move fast. James knew that the longer he waited, the more likely it was that Sandra and Damon would cover their tracks. He needed to get the evidence to the authorities, and he needed to do it before they had a chance to destroy it. As he powered up his laptop, James's mind raced. He opened his encrypted files, checking the evidence he had stored. The flash drive contained everything: invoices, meeting notes, fraudulent contracts, and records of Redstone Innovations siphoning money from government contracts. But there was more. He knew there was something even more damning: the manipulation of the pension funds. If the government investigated that, it would bring down the entire operation. James knew what he had to do. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to get everything into the hands of the authorities now. But just as he was about to send the files to James Parker, his phone buzzed again. This time, the number was familiar. Greg from purchasing. Greg had been fired months earlier after raising concerns about invoice discrepancies. James had always trusted Greg, and now it seemed like he was reaching out for help. "James," Greg's voice came through the phone, strained with worry. "I need to talk to you. It's about what's going on at Redstone. They're doing something big, something illegal, but I need to meet you in person." "Where?" James asked, already grabbing his coat. "The diner, 2 towns over. It's the only place I trust." When James arrived at the diner, he saw Greg sitting in a booth, looking around nervously. He slid into the seat across from him. "What's going on, Greg?" James asked, his voice low. "What have you heard?" Greg leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been changing the records, backdating approvals, creating false paper trails. But there's more. Damon and Sandra are planning to sell the manufacturing division to a private equity group, and they're hiding the truth about the pension fund. They've been borrowing from it for months. If they go through with this sale, there won't be enough to cover the employees' pensions. Hundreds of people are going to lose everything." James's heart sank. The pension fund. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation even more dire. The implications were staggering. If this went public, it could destroy the company completely. But more importantly, it could ruin the lives of everyone who had worked there for years, trusting the company to provide for them in retirement. "I need your help, Greg," James said urgently. "Do you have any documentation? Anything that can back this up?" Greg pulled out a small folder from his jacket, his hands shaking as he handed it over. "It's not much, but it's a start." James opened the folder, scanning through the papers quickly. They were just as damning as he had feared: falsified records, phantom inventory, and evidence of pension fund mismanagement. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and James knew that he had to act quickly. He stood up, his mind made up. "I'm sending this to the authorities today. We can't wait any longer." Greg nodded, his face grim. "Be careful, James. If they know you have this, they'll come after you. They've already started watching me." James's stomach twisted. He had known the risks, but now they felt more real than ever. They were no longer just threats. They were beginning to take action. Later that evening, James sat in his home office once again, his laptop open in front of him. He attached the files, double-checked everything, and then, with one final glance at the folder, clicked send. As the email went out to James Parker and the authorities, James leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. The battle was on. But as he sat there, waiting for the inevitable retaliation, a part of him felt a sense of relief. He had done everything he could. The truth was out. And now, no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. Sandra and Damon were about to face the consequences of their actions. The final countdown had begun.